The altimeter was spinning the wrong direction when Myra Sokolova noticed the pressure setting had drifted 14 millibars below field elevation, and she corrected it with the same flat economy of motion she had used for 21 years in cockpits ranging from converted crop dusters in Tbilisi to the Su-25 strike jets she had flown out of Kandahar Bagram, and 3 forward operating locations whose names appeared on no publicly available maps. 17 combat deployments. 1,248 flight hours in type. She noticed the drift, she corrected it. She did not mention it to First Officer Daniel Chukwu seated to her right because there was nothing to mention. It was already fixed, and the sky ahead over the North Atlantic was the particular shade of dark blue that existed only above 40,000 feet, the color that had no name in any language she had tried to find it in, and which she had privately decided was the closest thing to peace she had ever personally encountered. Flight 1847 to London Heathrow was 4 hours and 17 minutes out of Toronto Pearson. 236 passengers, 8 crew, full fuel load. An outside building from the northwest at a rate the dispatchers with their package had underestimated by a figure that would later become a significant footnote in the accident investigation report. A convective system the size of a small country was rotating into their path. She had known something was wrong before the radar painted it. Not the instruments were fine, all green, all nominal, the way they always were right up until they weren't. She had known it the way she always knew things at altitude, which was through a calculation that happened below the threshold of conscious thought, an integration of inputs so numerous and varied that no checklist could enumerate them and no simulator could fully replicate them. The way the stars ahead were disappearing at a rate inconsistent with natural cloud cover, the way the aircraft's nose was behaving in the yaw axis with a subtlety that suggested wind shear building from a direction the autopilot had not yet registered, the way the outside air temperature had dropped 11 degrees in the last 4 minutes when the meteorological forecast called for 3. She had 17 deployments worth of atmospheric anomaly recognition stored somewhere behind her sternum, and every one of them was saying the same quiet, professional thing, which was, "Pay attention, something is arriving." She had been paying attention since the age of 11. In Tbilisi in 1984, when the Soviet infrastructure was already beginning to fray at the edges, and the neighborhood where she grew up had begun to smell like concrete dust and anxiety, she had paid attention to her father's hands as he drew aircraft on paper napkins over dinner. Not the whole aircraft, just the cross-sections, the wing profiles, the lift equation reduced to its most elegant terms. Her father had been an aeronautical engineer at the Civil Aviation Institute, and he had the particular madness of a man who understood something beautiful and could not stop explaining it to anyone who would sit still. She had always sat still. She had always listened. She had memorized the lift equation at 9, the drag polar at 10, and at 11 she had understood in the way that children understand things that will define them, that she would spend her life in the sky. Not because it was romantic, because it was where the physics was cleanest. She became a military pilot because in Georgia in the early 1990s, there was no other path for a woman who wanted to fly anything faster than a Cessna, and because her father had died in 1991 during the civil conflict that followed independence, killed in an artillery strike on the institute that made international news for approximately 48 hours and then disappeared from the record entirely, as small deaths in small countries do. He had died on a Thursday. She had stood at his grave on a Saturday that was very cold and very gray, and she had made him a promise that she did not speak aloud because the words for it did not exist in the form she needed, but which resolved itself inside her into something like, "I will fly. I will matter. I will make the sky count for something." She had kept the promise for 31 years without deviation, through the Georgian military aviation program, through the bilateral exchange postings that had landed her in NATO training rotations, through 17 deployments across 4 conflicts, through the injuries and the investigations and the commendation that was classified for 11 years after the engagement that earned it. And eventually, through the transition to civilian aviation that had been offered to her at the age of 44 as something between a gift and a very polite forced retirement, which she had accepted with the same equanimity she applied to all large institutional decisions, which was to say she had accepted it, and then immediately begun thinking about how to extract maximum usefulness from the new configuration. She was a senior captain for Transatlantic Continental. She flew the 777 exclusively. She had 4,900 hours on type, and she knew the aircraft the way she had known every aircraft she had ever commanded, which was not with affection exactly, but with the deep operational respect of someone who understood that a machine this complex was essentially a covenant. It would perform to its design limits if you performed within yours, and the moment you asked it to be something it wasn't, or allowed yourself to become something you weren't. The covenant broke, and the results were non-negotiable. The weather radar returned its first real picture of what was ahead at 2:17 UTC. Red, a great deal of red. She had seen red on a radar before in the Pankasi Gorge in 2003, when the weather and the enemy had been equally committed to preventing her from completing the mission, and she had completed the mission anyway, which was a different situation but carried the same cognitive architecture. Assess, prioritize, decide, act, assess again. She looked at the radar return for 4 seconds. She looked at the star field ahead, now entirely extinguished. She looked at the outside air temperature gauge, which had dropped another 3 degrees in the 90 seconds since she last checked it. Then she looked at Daniel Chukwu. "Wake up the cabin," she said. "Seatbelt sign on. Call the lead FA and tell her I want everyone seated and secured in the next 4 minutes, not 5, 4. He was 29 and had 4 years on the line and was excellent at the procedural parts of flying, which were the parts that most pilots confused with flying itself. He looked at the radar. He looked at her. He did not argue, which was to his credit, and he began executing, which was to his further credit. She heard him on the PA behind her, calm, professional, no alarm in his voice, the kind of announcement that passengers would discuss later as the moment they knew it was serious without knowing why they knew. She was already running the contingency in her head. The storm system was larger than the radar suggested, which was almost always the case with convective cells of this generation, and it was moving northeast faster than forecast, and the corridor between the system's southern edge and the Newfoundland coast, which was the only viable passage that did not require a full divert to either Gander or Halifax, was closing at a rate that gave her approximately 12 minutes before it was no longer viable. 12 minutes. She would need 10 of them. That was acceptable. She keyed the radio to Gander Oceanic. The frequency was clear. She gave her position, her intentions, her request for a deviation south of track to find the passage, and she listened to the response, which came back in the flat, professional voice of a controller who was looking at the same radar and had already been thinking about this particular aircraft and this particular storm for the last 20 minutes. Clearance granted. She turned the aircraft. If you are watching this channel and you have ever sat in the back of an aircraft while the captain made one of those quiet, ordinary-sounding announcements about turbulence ahead, please take a moment right now to subscribe, because what we are about to tell you about the 37 minutes that followed, and about the woman at the controls, is something the aviation industry has known in fragments for years, and has never assembled into a single account, and it is a story that deserves to be told completely. And if you are watching from Pakistan, from Georgia, from anywhere that has sent its pilots into skis that did not want them there, this story is especially for you. The passage south was there. Barely. She flew the 777 through a corridor that the simulator instructors at the training center in Miami would later describe, when they reviewed the flight data recorder output, as technically within limits but operationally at the extreme edge of what could be called a planned course of action. The storm system had walls, and those walls were vertical and active, and she flew between them at flight level 370 with a precision that required her to fly the aircraft manually, not because the autopilot couldn't theoretically handle it, but because at this specific intersection of turbulence, gradient, wind shear, and cell spacing, the autopilot's response time was a half-second too slow, and a half-second was the difference between coordinated and uncoordinated. She had known this without calculating it. She had known it the way she knew the altimeter had drifted 14 millibars, the way she knew the storm was larger than the radar suggested, through the accumulated weight of 21 years of professional attention, which was not instinct but was something built from the same materials as instinct and functionally indistinguishable from it in the moment when it was needed. The 777 was a magnificent aircraft. She had opinions about aircraft that would have surprised people who knew her only as a commercial pilot of sober professional reputation. And about the 777, her opinion was that it was the closest thing to honest that Boeing had ever built, a machine that told you clearly and without drama exactly what it was doing and exactly what it needed from you, which was all she had ever asked of any aircraft she flew. It was also, at this moment, being asked to hold its structural envelope against forces that were arriving from 3 different vectors simultaneously, and it was doing so with a composure that she noted professionally and felt something adjacent to gratitude toward, though she would not have used that word. The passengers in the back were, by the account of every flight attendant and later every passenger who gave a statement, experiencing the worst turbulence of their lives. Seat belts were locked. Service had been suspended. The lead flight attendant, Kezia Oduya, a woman of 18 years' experience who had seen things in the back of airplanes that would constitute their own story, had strapped herself in at her jump seat and was doing the specific kind of prayer that is not about asking for anything but about acknowledgement, acknowledging that the outcome was not in her hands, and that what was in her hands was her behavior and her presence and her ability to project calm into the cabin around her. She was projecting it. The cabin was holding. Captain Daniel Chukwu's voice, level, controlled. A question had arrived that he didn't know how to ask. "I see it," she said. What she saw was that the southern wall of the cell was moving faster than the northern wall, which meant the passage was not holding its geometry. The corridor was narrowing. She had 7 minutes of passage left, maybe 6, and she was 3 minutes from the exit, maybe 4 depending on what the winds did in the next 90 seconds. The math was uncomfortable but not impossible. She adjusted her track 4 degrees right. She increased her airspeed by 11 knots. She felt the aircraft respond in the way that a very good aircraft responds to a direct and clear instruction, which was immediately and without complaint. She thought briefly of the Su-25. She was not sentimental about aircraft. She had left every cockpit she had ever climbed out of without looking back, because looking back was for people who confused the vehicle with the journey. But the Su-25 had been her aircraft for 9 years of her military career, and it had taught her things about airmanship that no other platform could have, specifically that an aircraft built for survival will survive things that should kill it, and that a pilot who has learned to trust that quality of a machine can access a different kind of calm in extremis than a pilot who has not. The 777 was not an aircraft built for survival in the military sense. But it was built by people who understood structures and margins and failure modes, and she trusted it the way she had trusted the Su-25, which was completely and specifically and without romanticism. She asked it to hold its envelope. It held. She did not tell you about the other thing that was happening in those minutes, because there was no audience for it in the cockpit, and she did not have a frame for describing it that she found adequate. What she would say later in the investigation debrief, and in the one interview she gave to an aviation journalist who had the background to understand the technical parts, was that the experience of flying an aircraft through a storm of that magnitude was not frightening in the conventional sense. It was demanding. It required everything she had. And what she had after 21 years of professional accumulation, after 17 deployments, after the engagements and the investigations and the classified commendation and the transition and the 4,900 hours on type was sufficient. Not comfortable, not easy. Sufficient, and sufficiency she had learned somewhere between Kandahar and Gander was the only standard that actually mattered. The aircraft exited the passage at 2:51 UTC. The turbulence dropped from severe to moderate to light over a period of approximately 90 seconds. The star field reappeared ahead. The radar returned behind them. When she turned it to rear look was a solid wall of red that was closing the passage they had just used with a kind of geological finality. She had 9 minutes to spare. She noted this. She resumed the autopilot. She looked at Daniel Chukwu. "Tell the cabin we're through it," she said, "and get Kezia on the phone. She did well back there." He relayed both messages. She heard faintly through the cockpit door the sound of applause from the cabin, not the kind of applause that people give performers, but the kind they give each other after something shared and survived. She did not turn around. There was always another hour of flying ahead, and the fuel state needed a check, and London was still 4 hours away, and applause was not something she had ever known how to receive. She had always known how to fly. The two skills were unrelated. Now, the part that the passengers on Flight 1847 never knew. The part that would not become public for 11 months, until a features writer at an aviation trade journal named Priya Sethuraman filed a Freedom of Information request that returned, after 2 extensions and 1 formal appeal, a partially redacted document that contained enough unredacted material to assemble the picture. The part that, once it was assembled, produced a silence in the offices of 2 military aviation commands that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with recognition. Myra Sokolova had not simply been a Georgian military pilot who transitioned to commercial aviation. She had been, for the last 4 years of her military career, attached to a bilateral exchange program that had embedded her in a U.S. Air Force aggressor training rotation at a location in Nevada that does not exist on publicly distributed maps. She had flown 48 training engagements against active F-22 Raptor pilots. She had won 31 of them. She had won them not through superior technology. The aircraft she flew in that program were capable but not comparable, but through something the F-22 pilots who faced her began to describe over the course of those 48 engagements as situational architecture. Not situational awareness, which every fighter pilot is trained to maintain. Situational architecture. The ability to construct, in real time, a 3-dimensional model of the engagement not as it currently existed, but as it was going to exist in 90 seconds, and to begin flying for the engagement to come while executing the engagement as. It was not something that could be trained directly. It was something that emerged from a certain kind of experience accumulated in a certain kind of environment under a certain kind of pressure. And she had accumulated it over 17 deployments in conditions that those F-22 pilots, excellent pilots, decorated pilots, the best of their generation, had not and could not have replicated without having been where she had been. The record of those 48 engagements was classified. The F-22 pilots who had faced her were not bound by any regulation from speaking about the experience generally, but they had not, as a group, chosen to do so, partly because fighter pilots have a specific relationship with losing that makes public discussion of particular losses uncomfortable. and partly because the more reflective among them understood that what she had done to them in those engagements was not about winning and losing in the way those terms are usually understood in a fighter pilot's framework, but about demonstrating something more fundamental, which was a way of inhabiting a cockpit that they had glimpsed across those engagements and had spent the years since trying, with varying degrees of success, to approximate. The report that Priya Sethuraman obtained contained, in its unredacted sections, the debrief summaries from 12 of those engagements. She read all of them. She quoted from 3. The language in the summaries was the flat, professional language of military after-action documentation, stripped of drama and metaphor, and yet reading them in sequence produced something that she later described in her article as a feeling like vertigo, the sensation that you were looking at something from the wrong angle, and that if you could just shift your perspective by a few degrees, the whole picture would resolve into a shape that was both surprising and, in retrospect, obvious. The summaries described pilot actions. They described maneuvering sequences. They described decision points and response times and energy management, and the specific geometries of engagements that had resolved in ways the F-22 pilots had not predicted and could not in the debrief fully account for. They described in the aggregate a pilot who was not doing what fighter pilots do. She was doing what fighter pilots aspire to do, which is a completely different thing. 3 of the F-22 pilots who had faced her in that rotation were, 11 months after the storm over the North Atlantic, still on active duty. Major Jonathan Fisk was at Langley Air Force Base, Virginia. Captain Derek Sorensen was at Elmendorf-Richardson in Alaska. Lieutenant Colonel Amara Oseibansu, born in Accra, Georgia, trained Top Gun graduate, the only female F-22 pilot in her squadron, and by the informal consensus of those who flew with her, the most naturally gifted stick-and-rudder pilot on the East Coast, was at Joint Base Langley Eustis and was the person who, when Priya Sethuraman called requesting comment, paused for a long moment and then said something that she quoted in full, because it required no additional context. "I don't lose often. When I do, I try to understand why. I never completely understood why with Myra, which means I'm still learning from it." The article ran. The aviation community read it. Then the mainstream press picked it up, filtered through the usual mechanisms that transform precision into approximation, and what emerged in the general public's understanding was a story about a female commercial pilot with a secret military past who had saved 236 passengers from a storm, which was true as far as it went. The storm was real. The passengers were real. The flying was real. What was lost in the transition from specialized to general audience was the part that the pilots understood, that what she had done over the North Atlantic was not separate from what she had done in those 48 engagements, and in 17 deployments, and in 9 years in the Su-25, but was the same thing expressed in a different medium. That the cockpit does not care about your resume, only your capability. That capability accumulated in extremis does not expire when the extremity changes its form. That she had saved 236 people using the same thing she had always used, which was the entirety of what she had spent her life becoming. She did not read the article. This is not a narrative embellishment. It is documented in the messages she exchanged with her chief purser, Kezia Oduya, who had sent her the link with a message that said simply, "This is about you," and received back after 11 hours a reply that said, "I saw it. Thank you for sending it." This was not modesty. She was not a person given to performed modesty, which is a form of performance, and she did not perform. She had seen the article and assessed it the way she assessed all information that concerned her, which was for accuracy and utility, and had concluded that it was reasonably accurate in its facts and not particularly useful to her professionally, since she did not need external documentation of her own history to know what her history was. The story mattered to the people for whom it was news. For her it was simply the record. She had been there. She knew what had happened. The knowing was complete without the telling. What she found more interesting and what occupied her in the weeks following the article's publication was a conversation she had not expected to have. It came in the form of a phone call from Major Jonathan Fisk, whom she had beaten in engagement number 12 of the 48, the one that the debrief summary described as the most unconventional energy management sequence observed in adversarial training in the past decade, which was, as she remembered it, a fairly standard response to an ambush from altitude, complicated by a radio failure that she had managed without aborting the engagement. Because radio failures were problems to be solved within the engagement, not reasons to end it. He called because he had read the article and because he had, in the 11 months since the article and the 7 years since the engagement, been carrying a question he had never known how to ask and had decided, upon reading the article, that he would not carry it any longer. "I've been trying to understand what you did in that engagement," he said. "Number 12, the energy management. I've flown variations of that scenario 40 times since. I've never gotten the same result." She thought about this. She thought about how to answer it accurately, which was her only criterion for any question that arrived in good faith. She thought about what she had actually done in Engagement 12, which was, as she experienced it, not a sequence of calculated decisions, but a continuous integration of the situation as it existed and the situation as it was becoming, and a set of actions that addressed both simultaneously. She thought about her father's cross-sections on paper napkins, the wing profile, the lift equation in its most elegant form. She thought about 17 deployments and what they had built, layer by layer, in the part of her professional cognition that operated below the threshold of deliberate thought. "You were flying the aircraft you had," she said finally. "I was flying the aircraft I was going to have in 90 seconds. A silence. "That's not something you can practice," he said. "No," she said, "it's something you accumulate." Another silence, and then he said something she had not expected, which was, "Thank you for the engagement. I know that sounds strange, but it changed how I think about the cockpit. I wanted you to know." She did not know what to do with gratitude that arrived in that form, which was the acknowledgement not of a gift given but of a lesson absorbed, the highest form of professional respect, and the one she was least equipped to receive. She said, "You're flying better because of it," and when he said yes, she said, "Then it mattered," and it had. And that was, as her father had told her over a napkin cross-section of a wing in a kitchen in Tbilisi in 1984, the only thing that flying ever needed to do. She became a training captain the following year. Not because the airline asked her to, they asked her, but she had already decided independently, because the accumulation that had built in her over 21 years had reached the point where the most useful thing she could do with it was transfer it. And transferring it required a formal context and a structured relationship with pilots who were at the beginning of their accumulation and needed someone to show them not the procedures. The procedures were documented. The procedures were teachable through conventional means, but the way of being in a cockpit that made the procedures coherent, that made them not a list of steps but an expression of a coherent relationship between pilot and machine and sky. She taught this without naming it because it had no name she found adequate. She demonstrated it in the air, in training flights, in the moments when something went subtly wrong in the simulator, and she responded with the flat professional attention of someone for whom wrong was not an exception but a permanent condition to be continuously managed. Her trainees absorbed it the way she had absorbed her father's cross-sections, not through understanding exactly but through proximity, through repeated exposure to someone who inhabited a cockpit in a particular way, until that way of inhabiting it became their own. Lieutenant Colonel Amara Osaibansu transitioned to commercial aviation herself 2 years later. She requested Myra's training rotation. She got it. They flew together for 6 months. They did not discuss the 48 engagements. They discussed the aircraft. They discussed atmosphere. They discussed the difference between flying to a procedure and flying to an outcome, which is the deepest distinction in all of aviation and the one that separates pilots who survive the worst from pilots who only survive the ordinary. At the end of the rotation, when Amara was certified in current and ready for the line, she sat with Myra in the crew room at Toronto Pearson after the last simulator session and said, "Now I understand what you were doing." And Myra looked at her not with surprise but with the recognition of one professional for another who has arrived at a conclusion through their own work and said, "What do you think I was doing?" And Amara said, "Flying for the aircraft you were going to have." And Myra said, "Yes," and that was the whole of it, and it was sufficient. Before you leave this video, take a moment to leave a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us what part of this story stopped you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because the stories we tell on this channel are stories that deserve to be told completely, and we are only beginning. The investigators who reviewed Flight 1847's flight data recorder and quick access recorder in the months following the storm produced a report that was technical and precise and accurate, and for anyone reading it without the background to understand what the numbers described, almost entirely opaque. The vertical acceleration trace told you that the aircraft had experienced turbulence. The airspeed trace told you the airspeed had been actively managed. The control input trace told you that the autopilot had been disengaged and that manual inputs had been applied continuously for 22 minutes and 17 seconds. The altitude trace told you the aircraft had remained within its assigned altitude block throughout. None of the traces told you what it meant to manage airspeed against a sheer gradient while holding altitude in a corridor that was narrowing in real time, or what it required of a human being to maintain the quality of input necessary for 22 minutes and 17 seconds in those conditions, without a single input that exceeded the structural margins or fell below the control margins. The investigators knew what it meant. They wrote it the way professional investigators write these things, which was plainly and without admiration, because admiration is not a category in technical analysis. Their plain language said, between every line, what it always says when it describes this kind of flying, which is, this person knew what they were doing. She retired at 62. Not because she had to, she was current and proficient, and her medical was clean, and the airline would have kept her as long as she wanted, but because she had done the calculation that she applied to all large decisions, which was to assess what the most useful configuration of her remaining years was, and had concluded that the answer was not the line but the broader work of transmission. The talks, the papers, the advisory roles, the mentorship relationships that did not fit into a formal training context but were nonetheless real and ongoing. She had trainees flying the line on 4 continents. She had contributed, through the advisory relationship she had maintained with the bilateral exchange program, to the training design of a simulator protocol that was now standard in 3 NATO air forces. She had written nothing under her own name, the one piece of formal documentation she produced in her professional life. A 14-page technical note on manual flying techniques for large transport aircraft in severe weather conditions was submitted without her name attached because she did not write it for credit but for utility, and credit was not utility. Her retirement ceremony was attended by airline colleagues and military figures, and the 3 F-22 pilots and Amara Osaibansu and Kezia Oduya, and a group of men and women she had never mentioned to the airline, who had flown in from 4 countries and who stood at the back of the room and did not explain who they were but whose presence was understood by the people who understood these things. She spoke for 4 minutes. She said that flying was the most honest profession she had known, because the sky did not care about your credentials or your history or your rank, only your capability, and that this was a form of justice she had always found clarifying. She thanked Daniel Chukwu, who had been the right first officer at the right moment, which was her way of saying she would not have traded him for anyone. She did not mention the storm by name. She did not mention the 48 engagements. She did not mention the classified commendation, which she wore on her uniform only on formal military occasions and which she had received for an action that 17 people were alive because of and which she was not permitted to describe in any public forum. She did not mention her father. She mentioned the sky. They told stories about her afterward, as people always do at these events, and the stories accumulated in the way that stories about exceptional pilots accumulate, the true ones growing larger with each telling, the embellishments falling away eventually under the weight of the true parts, which were themselves large enough that embellishment was genuinely unnecessary. They told the story of Flight 1847. They told stories from the training rotations, the simulator sessions where something went wrong, and she responded with an equanimity that the trainees initially found unsettling and eventually understood was not equanimity at all but competence so complete that it resembled equanimity. They told the story in fragments of the 48 engagements, the parts of it that were not classified and could be told, which were enough. They told stories about what she had said, and the stories she had told, and the silences she had maintained, and the standards she had held, and the way she had inhabited every cockpit she had ever entered. The 777 and the Su-25 and the training aircraft and the simulators and every aircraft between and before, with the same quality of presence, the same flat professional attention, the same willingness to be entirely there in a way that most people never manage to be. Not in cockpits and not anywhere. She died at 78 in her sleep in a small house outside Tbilisi that she had bought in the last year of her career, and repaired slowly and quietly over the decade that followed, the way she did everything that mattered to her, without announcement, without audience, with complete attention to the work. The house had a window that faced east and caught the first light in a way she had liked immediately when she saw the property and had continued to like every morning for the decade she lived there. The funeral was full. The eulogies were given in 4 languages and covered aspects of her life that did not overlap, because no single person had been present for all of it, and she had not believed in comprehensive self-revelation, only in the work, which was its own revelation if you knew how to read it. Children who read her name on a plaque years later, in a display at the Toronto Pearson Aviation Heritage exhibit, or in the foyer of the training center in Miami where the technical note she had submitted without her name was eventually attributed to her and printed in full, passed it without pausing because it was a name on a plaque. Veterans paused longer, reading the full text, remembering what the numbers meant. The F-22 pilots who had faced her in 48 engagements remembered her with the specific quality of memory that professionals reserve for the encounters that changed how they thought about their profession, which is not nostalgia but something more precise. The awareness that your current capability contains the ghost of a lesson learned under conditions that cannot be recreated, only honored. Amara Osaibansu told her trainees about her without always nomming her, because the lessons did not require attribution, only transmission. The trainees absorbed the lessons and flew better and would one day transmit them forward in their own way, which was how knowledge of this kind survived. But what they remembered most, all of them, the trainees and the F-22 pilots and the passengers who wrote letters afterward and the crew members who had flown with her and the investigators who had read the recorder traces and the investigators who had sat across from her in the windowless rooms that follow the kinds of actions she had taken. Was something simpler than any of the technical achievements or the classified records or the storm in the passage and the 22 minutes and 17 seconds of continuous manual input. What they remembered was the quality of presence she brought every cockpit she entered, the way the aircraft seemed to know she was there, the way the sky seemed to receive her, the way she arrived every time without drama and without delay, exactly when she was needed and nowhere before. When the sky needed her, she came like a ghost out of the clouds, exactly when the passage was closing, exactly when it mattered most. And that, more than the 48 engagements or the classified commendation or the 4,900 hours or the storm over the North Atlantic or any single action in 17 deployments or the retirement ceremony or the plaque in the foyer, was what made her irreplaceable. She was simply there when you needed her. And when you needed her, she was everything.